Everyone knows Billy the Kid as the notorious outlaw, plastered on wanted posters and depicted as a cold-blooded killer. But what if the history books only told you half the story? What if the Wild West's most infamous figure also possessed a hidden, softer side, one marked by unexpected acts of compassion and surprising kindness? Prepare to see Billy the Kid in a light you never imagined. Forget everything you think you know about Billy the Kid. For decades, his legend has been cemented in violence and infamy, but beyond the gunfights and the breathless headlines, there's a largely untold narrative of surprising empathy and genuine human connection. We're about to uncover the astonishing acts of compassion that history conveniently left out, revealing a Billy the Kid far more complex than the myth. What if the bad guy was sometimes a hero? We're diving deep into the true, untold stories of Billy the Kid, not the one painted as a merciless killer, but the young man who, despite his outlaw status, showed incredible acts of compassion. You won't believe the moments of unexpected kindness and generosity from the Wild West's most wanted man that we're about to reveal. The morning air in the New Mexico Territory was a biting cold that clawed at the lungs. Billy sat by a small, flickering fire, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The brew was bitter and scorched, but the warmth was the only thing keeping the frost from settling into his bones. A few yards away, a small desert willow sapling struggled against the wind, its roots clinging to the cracked earth, the only green thing for miles. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered to the plant, his voice barely a rasp. He ran a thumb over the cold steel of his Colt .45, feeling the familiar weight of his autonomy. To him, the gun was a key, a document of his own making, a lock that only he could turn. He looked at the horizon, where the sun began to bleed a violent orange over the jagged peaks. A low vibration hummed through the ground before the sound of hooves arrived. Billy simply waited as 3 Mescalero Apache warriors appeared, their ponies silent as ghosts on the soft sand. Their leader, a man whose face was a map of deep arroyos and ancient wisdom, stopped his horse 10 paces away. The scent of sage and old leather drifted toward Billy, clashing with the smell of his own wood smoke. "The town ahead is a mouth of dry teeth, little boy," the chief said in a voice like grinding stones. He pointed toward the valley where the distant silhouette of a settlement sat like a trap. "The wind there does not sing. It warns. If you cross the river, the earth will no longer recognize your shadow. It is a place where the law has grown a taste for the blood of the young." Billy stood up, the rough fabric of his wool coat scraping against his shirt. He offered the chief a small pouch of tobacco, a silent gesture of respect for a culture that understood the land. "I've been told the weather is fine this time of year," Billy replied, a reckless grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The chief didn't smile. He saw the fire in the boy, but he also saw the ash. They watched. The Apache turned their horses, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze as the cold morning began its rapid transformation into a punishing noon. Billy watched them go until they were nothing more than a memory against the vast, indifferent blue of the horizon. He felt the weight of the chief's prophecy settling in his stomach like a cold stone. Billy ignored the warning, mounting his bay mare as the temperature climbed with a sudden predatory speed, the biting frost of the morning surrendering to a heat that felt like a heavy shroud draped over the landscape. He rode toward the river, the physical border where the Pecos snaked through the red dirt like a vein of black oil, marking the end of the wild and the beginning of a town that smelled of sun-bleached wood and unwashed desperation. As he crossed the shallow water, his horse's hooves clattered against the submerged stones with a rhythmic, hollow sound that seemed to echo the chief's words about a mouth of dry teeth. The town of Lincoln emerged from the shimmering haze not as a sanctuary, but as a collection of bleached adobe walls and shuttered windows that felt like dead eyes watching his every move. He noticed the way the wind here didn't howl. It hissed between the gaps of the buildings, carrying the faint, sickly sweet scent of lavender from a nearby porch that clashed violently with the metallic tang of waiting lead and old sweat. He noticed. In the center of the dusty square, tied to a sun-cracked hitching post that stood like a gallows, was a boy no older than 12, his small frame trembling under the arrogant hammer of the midday sun. The boy's hands were bound with rough hemp rope that had already chafed his wrists into raw, weeping sores, and his throat was so parched that his lips had split into bloody fissures, yet no sound escaped him. Above his head, a crude wooden sign had been nailed to the post, the ink jagged and black. "The silent shall learn to cry before they speak." Billy felt the silver pocket watch in his vest, the cold weight of his own stolen time pressing against his ribs as he stared at the boy's eyes, which were wide with a hollow, ancient terror that no child should possess. The boy was a living document of the sheriff's cruelty, a human lock that the law was trying to break with the sheer force of the elements. She couldn't. A young woman stood on a shaded porch a few yards away, her knuckles white as she gripped a bundle of dried lavender, her eyes darting between Billy and the dark interior of the sheriff's office. She wanted to move, to bring a ladle of water to the dying child, but the fear of the tin star was a noose around the neck of every soul in the valley, a boundary they were all too terrified to cross. Billy dismounted, the leather of his boots hitting the ground with a heavy final thud that kicked up a veil of grey dust around his spurs. He didn't look at the office. He looked at the boy, noticing how a single desert willow sapling had been trampled into the mud near the post, its thin leaves turning brown and brittle. The silence of the town was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies around the boy's face and the rhythmic creak of a distant windmill that sounded like a long, slow moan of a dying man. The heavy door of the jailhouse groaned open, and a man with a tin star pinned to a greasy leather vest stepped out, the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco preceding him like a warning. He was a man of iron and ego, his face like a slapped ham, and his eyes full of the borrowed authority that comes from holding a key to someone else's cage. He adjusted his belt, the metallic clink of his Winchester being leaned against the wall, ringing out like a gunshot in the stagnant air. "That there's a quiet devil, kid," the sheriff called out, his voice a gravelly rasp that lacked any hint of the mercy the desert so desperately needed. "He'll find his voice when the thirst gets louder than his pride, or he'll rot right there on that post as a lesson to those who think they can hide their secrets in silence." Billy's hand hovered near his Colt 45, the texture of the walnut grip familiar and grounding, a symbol of the only autonomy that mattered in a place where the law had grown a taste for the blood of the young. They watched. From behind the safety of their curtains and the shadows of their saloons, the townspeople peered out at the confrontation, their breath held in a collective vacuum of cowardice. Billy took a slow step toward the boy, pulling his canteen from the saddle, the sloshing of the water sounding like a miracle in the heat. He felt the tension in the air reach its absolute breaking point, a physical pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up as the sheriff's hand twitched toward his own holster. The girl with the lavender finally let out a stifled sob, the scent of the flowers suddenly overpowered by the sharp electric smell of ozone that always preceded a storm or a killing. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered to himself, the phrase a mantra of choice as he prepared to turn the key on a brand of justice the history books would never dare to write. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the storm that the chief had seen in the ash, and the town of Dry Teeth was about to learn that some silences were louder than any scream. The heat became an arrogant hammer by midday as Billy rode his bay mare toward the outskirts of the town. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind through the ribcage of a dead steer. As he approached the river, he saw the physical border, a collapsed wire fence that once marked a rancher's dream. "Only if you want it to be," Billy muttered, echoing his morning prayer as he guided the mare across the rusted wire. The town smelled of stale beer, sun-bleached wood, and something metallic, the scent of waiting lead. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy, hollow thud. The dust kicked up around his ankles, coating his spurs in a fine grey powder. To his left, a young girl sat on a porch, clutching a bundle of dried lavender. He noticed. In the center of the dusty square, tied to a hitching post under the merciless sun, was a boy no older than 12. His throat was parched, his lips cracked into bloody fissures, and his hands were bound with rough hemp rope that bit into his skin. Above him, a sign was nailed to the post in crude black ink: "The silent shall learn to cry before they speak." "Sheriff says he's possessed by a quiet devil," the girl with the lavender whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "He's been there since Tuesday. The sheriff says the boy will find his voice once the sun burns the silence out of him." Billy felt the silver pocket watch in his vest, a heavy reminder of the minutes he had stolen from the hangman. Billy walked toward the boy, the leather of his boots creaking. He pulled a canteen from his saddle, the sloshing water sounding like a miracle in the stagnant air. Every shuttered window he passed felt like a dead eye, reflecting nothing but the harsh midday glare. The townspeople remained hidden, cowards hiding from the darkness they had invited with their hollow laws. She couldn't. The girl on the porch wanted to help, but the fear of the tin star was a noose around the town's neck. Billy reached the boy and pressed the cool tin of the canteen to the lad's lips. The boy's eyes, wide and full of a hollow terror, met Billy's. There was no sound, only the desperate gulping of water and the metallic tang of rising dust. The boy's throat worked convulsively, the water spilling down his chin and darkening the parched earth into a muddy red that looked uncomfortably like old blood. He noticed the way the child's fingers, thin and translucent as dry parchment, clawed instinctively at Billy's leather sleeve, seeking a tether to a world that had tried to erase him with silence. The metallic tang of the tin canteen clashed with the sudden sharp scent of wood smoke and old grease drifting from the nearby sheriff's office, a reminder that every act of mercy in this territory carried a heavy price. Billy looked up at the sign, the black ink shimmering under the arrogant sun like a fresh bruise, and felt the silver watch in his pocket, his mechanical heart, ticking away the seconds of a peace that was never meant to last. The heavy, rhythmic thud of spurs on the boardwalk broke the stillness, a sound like a hammer striking an anvil in a hollow room. Out of the amber shadows of the jailhouse stepped a man whose presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature, his skin the color of cured leather, and his eyes as cold as a mountain stream. The tin star, pinned to his sweat-stained vest, caught the midday glare, flashing like a warning beacon to anyone foolish enough to challenge the order he had carved out of the dust. He noticed the way the sheriff's hand hovered near the ivory grip of his peacemaker, the man's knuckles white and calloused from years of holding the leash on a town too terrified to breathe. "That water's property of the county, Bonnie, and that boy is a ward of the law until he decides to find his tongue," the sheriff growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the very dust dance. They watched from behind the safety of their lace curtains and half-closed shutters, a congregation of ghosts waiting for the first drop of rain in a drought. Billy stood up slowly, the rough wool of his trousers scraping against his skin, his movements fluid and deliberate as he recapped the canteen with a metallic click that echoed through the square. The scent of lavender from the girl's porch drifted between the two men, a fragile domestic ghost caught in a crosswind of gunpowder and unwashed wool. Billy didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he adjusted his Stetson, the shadow of the brim cutting across his eyes like a physical border between the boy's salvation and the sheriff's pride. "A boy ain't a document you can just file away, or a lock you can break until it fits your key, Sheriff," Billy replied, his voice a soft rasp that carried more weight than a shout. The tension in the square became a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket of heat that made the scent of the nearby stables, manure, hay, and old sweat, nearly unbearable. The sheriff took a step off the boardwalk, his boots sinking into the fine grey powder of the street, his face contorting into a mask of righteous fury. In this town, silence is a crime against the peace, and I'm the only one who decides who gets to speak and who stays bound, the lawman spat, the shadow of his heavy frame falling over the mute boy like a shroud. Billy looked toward the distant ridge, where the silhouette of the Mescalero warriors remained as still as stone carvings, their spiritual presence a silent judgment on the civilization unfolding in the valley. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered, the phrase a mantra of autonomy that felt like a cold blade against the sheriff's heated rhetoric. With a movement so sudden it seemed to crack the air, Billy's hand blurred toward his belt, but it wasn't his Colt that emerged. The sharp, silver flash of a Bowie knife sliced through the stagnant light as he dropped to one knee, the edge of the blade singing as it bit through the rough hemp ropes that held the boy captive. The sound of the rope snapping was like a gunshot in the absolute silence of the town, a declaration that the physical borders of the sheriff's authority had been breached. As the boy fell forward, free from his cage of cord and sun, Billy looked the sheriff directly in the eyes, his reckless grin returning like a predator's strike. "The boy's found his voice, Sheriff," Billy said, the cold steel of his gaze matching the blade in his hand. "He just decided he didn't have nothing to say to a man like you." The swing doors of the saloon creaked on dry hinges like a funeral dirge as Billy stepped inside. The interior was a cavern of amber light and thick tobacco smoke. At the bar, a man with a tin star pinned to a greasy vest turned slowly, a sheriff with a face like a slapped ham and eyes full of borrowed courage. The smell of frying bacon drifted from the back, a domestic scent that felt like a lie in this den. "I heard a rumor you were a man who liked to talk, kid," the sheriff said, leaning heavily against the polished mahogany bar. "But in my town, we don't care for those who can't speak up for themselves. That boy outside is a document of my authority." Billy didn't answer immediately. He reached for a bottle of rye, the glass cool against his grime-streaked palm. "I'm just here for the shade, partner," Billy said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at the heavy iron lock on the back door of the saloon, a symbol of the town's fear. He realized then that the town wasn't a cage for him, but a cage for them. They were terrified of the boy who didn't care about their borders or their documents of ownership. He noticed. The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster, a nervous, jerky movement that signaled the end of the talking. The silence in the room became a vacuum, sucking the air from the lungs of every man present. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing the scent of the desert willow, the sapling from the morning, back into Billy's mind. "That boy outside is mute, not stupid," Billy said, setting the glass down with a soft click. "You've got him tied up like a dog for a crime of nature. That ain't law, Sheriff. That's just a man with a badge and a small soul trying to feel tall." The heat in the room surged, a stifling, suffocating wave that made the sheriff's sweat-stained collar look like a noose. They watched. The patrons shrank away from the bar, leaving a circle of dead space where the air felt brittle enough to crack. The sheriff's face turned a violent shade of red. "You're a wanted man, Bonnie. You don't get to talk about soul, you get to talk to the hangman." He stepped toward the door, his spurs singing a lonely, rhythmic dirge. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon when they stepped back out onto the street. The shadows were long, black fingers reaching out to claim the dust. The sheriff stood 10 paces from the tied boy, his silhouette a block of iron and law. Beyond the sheriff, Billy saw the Apache warriors perched on the ridge, silent observers of a ritual they had seen 1,000 times before. "You were warned," the sheriff called out, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "The wind doesn't sing here, it screams." Billy adjusted his hat, the texture of the brim rough against his skin. He looked at the boy, who was watching with a predatory curiosity, as if he had already tasted what the law was preparing. The duel was a blur of motion and thunder. The Colt 45 jumped in Billy's hand, the recoil a familiar kick against his palm. Smoke bloomed in the air, white and sulphurous, obscuring the world. When the haze cleared, the sheriff was on his knees, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth, not dead but broken. Billy walked toward the hitching post. He didn't fire again. Instead, he used the edge of his Bowie knife to slice through the hemp ropes. The boy slumped into Billy's arms, his skin hot as a branding iron. Billy knelt in the dirt, the cold returning to the air as the sun disappeared. He touched the boy's shoulder, feeling the persistence of the roots that remained under the surface. He reached into his vest, pulled out the silver pocket watch, the mechanical heart that pulsed with a time the wilderness didn't recognize, and placed it in the boy's hand. "It's yours now, kid," Billy whispered. "Your time. Your autonomy. Your choice." The boy's fingers brushed against the cold, smooth glass, a treasure from a man the world called a monster. They watched. Billy mounted his bay mare and rode toward the river. As he reached the far bank, he looked back at the town, now just a cluster of shadows and flickering lamps. He whispered to the wind, his voice finally at peace with the desert. "Only if you want it to be." The earth now recognized his shadow as part of its own jagged, broken landscape. Billy rode deep into the purple shadows of the canyon, where the scent of scorched earth and spent gunpowder finally surrendered to the clean, biting fragrance of mountain juniper and wild sage. The temperature plummeted with the vanishing sun, turning his breath into a ghostly mist that danced around his face before being snatched away by the biting wind. He noticed how the silence here was different. Not the suffocating, guilty silence of the town of dry teeth, but a living, breathing stillness that held the weight of the stars. The silver watch was gone, but the rhythmic ghost of its ticking still seemed to pulse against his ribs. A phantom limb of the time he had surrendered to a boy who had no voice to thank him. They watched from the high ridges. Their presence felt long before the first horse whinny broke the quiet, as the Mescalero warriors descended like smoke from the jagged peaks to meet the outlaw at the border of their world. The chief approached on his paint horse, his face illuminated by the rising moon like a map of deep arroyos and ancient granite. He didn't look at Billy's gun or the fresh bloodstains on his sleeve. Instead, his gaze went straight to the boy's empty vest, where the mechanical heartbeat had once rested. The smell of cedar smoke and old leather enveloped Billy, a comforting contrast to the metallic tang of the jewel that still clung to his clothes like a second skin. "You gave away your heartbeat, little boy," the chief said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the territory. To give a person their own time is to give them back their soul, a gift the desert rarely sees from those who carry lead and iron in their holsters. Billy felt the rough texture of his reins, his calloused hands steady even as the adrenaline of the fight finally began to ebb away into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that tasted of dust and copper. She couldn't understand the law of the desert, that girl back in town with her lavender and her fear. But Billy saw it now in the way the chief offered him a single dried root of the osha plant. It was a gesture of brotherhood, a document of peace written in the language of survival that predated any tin star, territorial line, or heavy iron lock. The wind screamed through the canyon, a wild morning sound that carried the echoes of the sheriff's broken authority. But Billy didn't look back at the flickering lamps of the settlement. He realized that justice was not a gavel or a cage, but a choice made in the dark when the only witness was the moon, a small act of mercy that grew like the willow sapling against the impossible odds of the parched earth. The warriors didn't celebrate the violence. They simply acknowledged the balance had been restored, their dark eyes reflecting the cold fire of a man who was both a killer of men and a savior of children. As he moved further into the wilderness, Billy stopped to rest by a hidden spring, the water bubbling through the red rocks with a sound like silver coins hitting a saloon floor. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had fanned the colt. 45 with lethal precision, now gently clearing a circle of stones around a tiny, struggling sprout of mountain mahogany. The cold was an absolute crushing force now, but he felt a strange warmth radiating from his chest, a heat that had nothing to do with a fireplace or a bottle of cheap rye. He noticed the way the moonlight hit the broken fence line of the horizon, realizing that every boundary was a lie. A fence meant to be jumped, a lock meant to be picked by those brave enough to claim their own name. The sapling's roots were deep, hidden from the sun but drinking from the secret veins of the world, much like the mute boy's newfound spirit. The final morning light began to bleed across the sky in streaks of violet and gold, turning the desert into a sea of amber that swallowed the memory of the town's cruelty. Billy stood at the edge of a high plateau, his bay mare huffing white clouds into the crisp thin air as he looked out over a land that recognized no master and respected no badge. He felt the weight of his legend pressing down on him, the wanted posters, the lies, and the infamy. But he also felt the light, soaring weight of the mercy he had left behind in a small boy's hand. He leaned down, whispering to the vast, empty expanse of the frontier, his voice a promise to the earth and the sky that the story was not yet finished. "Only if you want it to be," he said, the words a final prayer for a world that was harsh and unyielding, but could be made kind by a single hand. They watched as he disappeared into the shimmering light of the new day, a ghost riding toward a horizon that offered no forgiveness, only the infinite beautiful freedom of the wild.